Okay, I think quite a lot of people could connect to the session now, so we will start. Hello, good morning for those who are in Europe, and good afternoon for those who are in the Indo-Pacific. Right now, I'm Céline Pajon. I'm Senior Fellow with the Japan program at VUB, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar. This is the first installment of the series of events that the Japan program VUB will start for this academic year. So for this first event, we chose to look at Japan, EU and ASEAN, their role and place in the Indo-Pacific and how they interact with each other. And indeed, as you know, ASEAN centrality has been a defining feature of the regional architecture in East Asia. And the importance of upholding multilateralism is underscored both in the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which has been released quite recently, and also in Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. But what we've seen in recent years is the growing competition between the US and China. And this competition is leading to an unprecedented polarization and fragmentation of the strategic landscape. And the recent announcement of AUKUS and the empowerment of the Quad are further questioning, I believe, the role and place of ASEAN and multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific. So this is a very, very exciting and very timely topic to look at right now. And our first panel will focus on the outside-in views of the region of ASEAN. And we have a great lineup of speakers with us today to deal with all of this. And I will briefly introduce them. First, Bruno Ellendorf will provide a European perspective of ASEAN. Bruno is currently attaché at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belgium. He is also lecturer at the Université Catholique de Louvain. He has previously worked as a research fellow in various think tanks and institutes and a specialist of Southeast Asia, EU-Asia relations, maritime security, and non-proliferation. So thanks a lot, Bruno, for joining. Then Tsutomu Kikuchi will offer a Japanese vision of ASEAN. Kikuchi-san is professor at the Aoyama Gakuin University. He is also a senior adjunct fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs, JIIA. He has a long career in academia and he worked extensively on regional institution building and on ASEAN affairs and Japan-ASEAN relations. Thanks a lot, Kikuchi-san, for joining us today. And last but not least, Rong Le Tu will discuss what's the place and role of ASEAN in great power competition. Dr. Le Tu is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, based in Canberra, where she leads a project on Southeast Asia. She also works on broader issue of foreign policy and grand strategy, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Prior to joining ASPI, she taught at the National University of Australia and held several research positions, including at the ISEAS Institute in Singapore. So thanks a lot, Hong, to connect from Canberra, from so far away. So before we start, let me remind you that this webinar is on the record. The video will be posted later on the Japan program YouTube channel. And after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So please do not hesitate to write down your question on the Q&A box of your Zoom window, and I will do my best to gather the question and to direct them to our speakers. And please start to think about your question right now, because we have only 1 hour and 15 minutes, and time is really flying when we discuss this kind of topics. So now, without further ado, we'd like to turn to Bruno Ellendorf, give him the floor. Bruno, could you tell us a little bit more about where those ASEAN and ASEAN countries stand in the EU Indo-Pacific agenda right now? You have approximately 10 minutes for your initial remarks. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, thanks, Celine, and thanks to the team. It's a distinct pleasure and an honor to be with you guys and among so distinguished a lineup of experts. I have to stress also that I speak in my own name, and that none of what I will say should be taken as congruent or as part of an official position by Belgium. Now, to answer your question, Celine, I think I'd like to make three arguments. And the first is that ASEAN centrality is absolutely the key to the EU's principled approach to the Indo-Pacific. It's basically, it's the basis of effective multilateralism in Indo-Pacific as it is, but it is also as such that it is understood by the EU in the EU. And as a reminder, multilateralism is an effective multilateralism is also, as is often repeated by diplomats, in the DNA of the EU. So that will be my first point. The second is that some privileged bilateral relationships with ASEAN countries constitute useful and important leverage points for the EU. They provide an opportunity to move on the agenda, be it multilateral or the European agenda itself, deliver on projects, specific projects earmarked for deliverables, and they guarantee to the EU's approach and strategy a pragmatic focus, which has long been a criticism against the EU, that it was not pragmatic enough or not interest-based enough. So these are the two first points. And the third is that context now is, as you, Celine, mentioned very well in the introduction, we're at a turning point, and AUKUS certainly will prove important to the future of the strategy. As you all know, this was announced, so the strategy was published the same day that the AUKUS partnership was announced. So this makes it a particular timing and one that will have to be dissected, and I don't see any better lineup of experts and quality people as this one to do so. So these are my three arguments that I will review in turn. On ASEAN centrality, well, the Indo-Pacific is no questions. It's absolutely essential and growing in importance for the EU. It is seen as a strategic region that produces 60% of global GDP, concentrate 2/3 of global growth. These are known figures, right? It's also a region where 1/3 of EU exports go, but also from which 44% of EU imports originate. In terms of climate change and very prominent rising topics such as ocean governance and such, really this region concentrate much of that. Just to quote one number that is in the strategy, the Indo-Pacific went from a global share of CO2 emission of 37% to 57% between 2000 and now. So it's important now that we realize this, that interest and values do not represent a binary choice. The EU has long pleaded for a mixed approach. Sometimes the message was conflicted or not clear enough. Sometimes it was not delivered to the right forms, perhaps. But in essence, interests and values should go hand in hand, and their articulation is always a question of strategy and a question of adjustment based on here, at least to the EU's perspective, on the follow-up of the Lisbon Treaty. Now, having said that, the EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific stresses such values as human rights, democracy, gender equality, things that are very important as well, and that should remain also part of the discussion on strategic issues in the Indo-Pacific, or so the EU believes. The third sub-point on ASEAN centrality is that within the EU, ASEAN is seen as the guarantee for a continued rules-based order. And that is based on the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, the many forums that provide circles around ASEAN, the ASEAN Charter itself, and of course the fact that ASEAN and EU are now strategic partners with a plan of action that aims to deliver in concrete terms on this, with the Blue Book 2021, for instance. And I mean, we also have to relate to the reality on the ground. I mean, the Indo-Pacific is seen in many European capitals as the region where great power competition is obviously rising and focusing more and more, where rules-based regional order is seen under stress. And so it's an opportunity to emphasize once again that the EU supports and welcomes the possible conclusion of a code of conduct, a legally binding code of conduct in the South China Sea between China and ASEAN as one prominent instance of an opportunity to consolidate rules-based order as opposed to might makes right all around. So that was the first point on the centrality of ASEAN. And the second, again, is the value of bilateral relationship, privileged bilateral relationship. So the EU has a very broad inclusivity. Inclusiveness is certainly part and parcel of the EU strategy vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. But here again, it should be mentioned first on history that the EU has been long pressed to clarify its commitments to the region. What does it mean for the EU to commit to the region? Will you come with an aircraft carrier? Yes, no. And these questions are often come to the table. Another thing that the EU has long been to is to deliver on its ambitions. If you say you're committing to the region, what will you actually be delivering? And in what timetable? On what timetable? So what the EU is taking, again, the EU being the actor that it is, it's basing its strategic outlook on various strategic documents and various partnerships that really anchor it in the region. So there is the EU's China strategic outlook from 2019 that many people are familiar with. There are the connectivity plans of EU-Japan and now the EU-India that have been not just drastically augmented, but also whose value are rising by the weeks. And then the EU strategy is insisting in very explicit terms on the value of EU ROK, EU US, EU ASEAN, EU Australia, and EU New Zealand cooperation, as these countries do and institutions do have an Indo-Pacific vision. So in addition to partnership to new cooperation agreements that should be signed are being negotiated with Thailand, Malaysia, possibly in Maldives. These provide really a framework that anchor it in the reality of diplomacy today and of an Indo-Pacific reality that has some diplomatic content. But then also the EU is trying to make a difference by itself, not just in diplomatic terms, but also on the ground. And here too, you can find some within ASEAN, because that was a question, at least 3 countries where you can find a focus by Europe. In Vietnam especially, but also Indonesia, despite irritants such as the palm oil issue, or EU Singapore. So in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore, the EU has found very important, critical partners. And they are all, and it's not a surprise, in the big project that has been put forward by the EES, enhancing security cooperation in and with Asia, which is one of the biggest such project undertaken by the EU. So in conclusion, for the second point, it's via those bilateral relationship that the EU can progress on actual projects to complement its multilateral engagement, and also progress on shared projects themes within multilateral framework. So for instance, if you manage a working group, a joint working group, EU-Japan, Vietnam on IUU in the framework of ARF, for instance. So that was the second argument. And the third, I will not discuss it too much because I think there are more competent people than me to discuss it, which is a turning point provided by AUKUS. This famous stab in the back, so said French defense minister, demonstrates several things. The first is a renewed or continued US commitment to the region with less focus on Europe. And so it demonstrates also the necessary review of the French strategy on the Indo-Pacific, or at least its implementation. Demonstrate the contingency, at least the political contingency of that. And obviously, the rise of multilaterals, as you said, Celine, the fragmentation of the strategic landscape in the region. This, in a nutshell, is a strong incentive for the EU to press on its strategic autonomy and an opportunity for it to align its decision-making with a strategic objective in the Indo-Pacific. As a conclusion, that also the question, I think, importance of the EU-Japan relationship will only grow, if only because it will have to connect the connectivity agenda strategies with the Pacific, and me to do that, track 1.5 events are critical, and I think this the press one is a timely one, but I think more would be more than welcome on this topic. On this, I end, and I thank you again for patience.
Thanks a lot, Bruno, for this very comprehensive presentation to look at how EU is looking at ASEAN as an effective multilateral setting. I think we can come back on this maybe later on during the discussion. What is effective multilateralism? The role of the value also values in the European approach to the region, and how for no, because he would have to give us a little bit earlier. So if you have specific questions for him, just think about it right now and start to write it down. And so now I would like to turn to Kikuchi-san for his presentation on how Japan is viewing ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific and within its Indo-Pacific approach. Kikuchi-san, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Selina-san, thank you very much for inviting me this quite important webinar. I prepared the PowerPoint. I would share the documents. Can you listen? Strategies. And I would also address these issues, taking two elements into considerations. So one is a balance of powers and legitimacies, which I understand are critical elements underpinning stable regional orders. So my presentations, firstly I would discuss about the challenges and opportunities. What challenges we are facing, and also what opportunities we have right now to construct a stable regional orders. Then I move to how Japan has been approaching the issue of powers, balance of powers, and also how to make regional order more legitimate. I mean, by saying legitimate, regional orders are accepted as legitimate by regional countries, not just big powers. And first, challenges. We have two serious, challenges. One is, of course, caused by China, some unilateral and assertive behaviors. But we at the same time we need to manage our tension and conflict with China. So on the one hand, we have to stand up to China, but at the same time, we have to get along with China. So we have to pursue two goals simultaneously. Second is uncertainty of U.S. engagement with the Indo-Pacific. So for Japan and also for Japan's Indo-Pacific strategies, keep U.S. engagement in Indo-Pacific critical factors. So for last, especially for last several years, Japan have been doing a lot to keep U.S. engaged in Asia. But at the same time, we does not want to be fully entangled into U.S.-China relations, either Cold War types of confrontation or rapprochement or G2. So Japan looks for more space for maneuvering and more autonomies. So Japan needs regional architecture, not defined only by US-China bilateral dynamics. We have two serious challenges, but we have opportunities. So Indo-Pacific is more than US and China. For some strategic expert, some people's argument, based on the assumptions, there are only two countries in the Indo-Pacific, US and China, no other countries at all. But, I think, the US-China relation is quite important, but not the only variable defining the future of the Indo-Pacific. Now, new stakeholders strongly committed to the rule-based orders now emerging in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and also Oceanian regions. So they are not the pawn in the power politics among major powers. They have agencies to navigate in the great competitions. So they are entitled and capable to participate in Indo-Pacific regional order making. And first, Japan and the balance of powers. As I mentioned before, the US is indispensable players for the future of Indo-Pacific regional orders. And keeping US engaged in the region is critical in that context. We have been struggling to keep US engaged in the region through taking a variety of policy measures to enhance the alliance. So probably for the first time in the post-war our relation with the United States, Japan clearly recognized importance of convincing U.S. government and the people that Japan is a reliable ally of the United States by taking new initiative to enhance alliance with the United States. But to enhance the balance of powers, Japan taking new, another approaches. Japan moving southward, and we have been constructing a network of new alignment, the active engagement in Indo-Pacific countries, India, Australia, ASEAN countries, South Asia, and South Pacific. Last several years, we have seen the emergence of new bilateral relations and also multilateralism. Japan-India, Japan-Australia, Japan-Vietnam, and so forth. Also, we have been developing new trilateral relations, Japan-India, Australia, Japan, India, US, Malabar, naval exercise, and so forth. Also, recently, we have been enhancing quadrilateral security dialogue between Japan, India, US, and Australia. Last month, we had a in-person summit meeting in Washington. The Quad could contribute to keeping the US engaged in the regions. And simultaneously, Quad serve as mechanism put some institutional constraints against US unilateral behaviors. Also, through these new bilateral and multilateral arrangement, we have been supporting capacity building efforts and making regional countries more resilient against coercion and rulings, especially in the field of maritime security law and enforcement, also conducting joint naval exercise and so forth. Then, the matter of the legitimacies. As I mentioned, stable regional orders need legitimacies supported by all relevant stakeholders, not just big powers. Then we have been creating a web of new networks, including with ASEAN countries. And what Japan is attempting to do is to create a web of networks that will allow the country of the region to make their own decisions without being forced to choose one over the others in the major power rivalries. So we hope the countries of the Indo-Pacific adhere to firm stance of rejecting any behavior by other countries that deviates from international rules and norms. So we hope the countries in the Indo-Pacific, in the case of China, stand up to China when China take deviant behavior against regionally and globally endorsed rules and norms. But at the same time, simultaneously, we need to get along with China. Then we have been engaged in a constructive relation with China for last, even if we had a serious trouble with China. So in my understanding, in the coming years, decades, regional order in the Indo-Pacific will become more multipolar, not defined only by US-China bilateral dynamics. That order will be accepted as legitimate by stakeholders of these regions. And ASEAN is a critical actor in constructing rule-based multipolar regional orders. ASEAN could demonstrate the alternative narrative to the US-China centered narrative, such as New Cold War or G2. On ASEAN centralities, we have been supporting ASEAN centralities, but I think ASEAN should go beyond managing ASEAN-led regional architectures. ASEAN-led regional architectures are product of relatively stable regional environment after the end of the Cold War. Today, regional environment changing radically. I think ASEAN needs to cooperate with new emerging regional minilateralism, such as Quad. For example, we can the Quad and ASEAN can cooperate to implement ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific and so forth. And also in cooperation with other minilateralism, ASEAN could strengthen the members' national resilience. Strengthening national resilience are critical factors for ASEAN become independent player or factors in emerging regional orders. So European engagement quite important to construct rule-based multipolar in the Pacific. But we need a long-term commitment. So I hope we could see a strong domestic support in individual European countries, and also support beyond economic considerations. And in the coming years, the Indo-Pacific ASEAN countries can cooperate with the European countries through a variety of unilateral arrangement and so forth. But we have some concern about sustainability of European commitment given other pressing European president. So as I mentioned, we hope the European long-term commitment underpinned by a strong domestic support. So final remarks are, as I already mentioned, Indo-Pacific is more than US and China. So Indo-Pacific is not just a battleground by two superpowers, but a playground for other countries to play the constructive role to sustain and enhance rule-based regional orders. The countries of the Indo-Pacific are not bound at the mercy of power politics between US and China, but capable to navigate the great games over the future of the regions. So now is a moment to step away from long-standing and old-fashioned assumption that only major powers can define the regional orders. The free and open Indo-Pacific cannot be built by just a few countries. Current flux of regional order may provide a good opportunity to build multipolar regional orders with broader participation of the countries of the regions. So thank you very much. Yeah, I used more than 10 minutes. Sorry. Yeah.
No, thanks a lot, Kikuchi-san. It was perfect. Thanks a lot for your very clear picture of the region, and quite optimistic maybe assessment that the region will go multipolar, and that there is not only the US and China, but other countries can try to work together to actually get more briefing space and lead a rules-based regional order. But my question will be, well, it's getting maybe more and more complicated because we feel the pressure. I believe also Japan feels the pressure of the US to rally, and also to the Chinese assertive moves. So how to keep this briefing space in such a context is a very tough questions. But now I'm turning to Dr. Le Thu for the presentation, especially exactly on this topic in the era of AUKUS and the much empowered Quad. What about ASEAN? What about ASEAN multilateralism? Dr. Le Thu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you for having me. And it's a great pleasure to have an opportunity to virtually meet with many friends and colleagues in Asia and Europe. I was asked to present ASEAN views on Quad and AUKUS from my own point of view rather than any sitting in Australia. So I'll try to make my point in 10 minutes, very brief in sort of 3-4 framing question. The first is, yes, I am frequently asked to measure sort of views and opinions of Southeast Asian. What do they think about Quad? What do they think about AUKUS? Or even, recently we had discussion whether the Afghanistan withdrawal of US has any implications to Southeast Asia. Well, the first answer that comes to my mind is that increasingly ASEAN is being asked what are the regional reactions and responses and feelings, but not really what ASEAN has done. So it's becoming increasingly more passive rather than active. And that's probably the first trend that I wanted to identify, that there is increasing institutional density, whether we talk about Quad, AUKUS, and probably more things to emerge. And whether ASEAN likes it or not, it is now at the situation of reacting and responding and creating some narrative about the emerging trends, but increasingly is not the one that drives those initiatives or comes up with new ideas, be them strategic arrangements or not. So I was asked to talk about the ASEAN perception because I did a study on all ASEAN countries' view on Quad several years ago after the Quad was revived. And one of the most important findings then and as well as now is that the reception and perception will be very mixed within ASEAN. Always going to be quite diverse, depending on the security outlook of the individual ASEAN state, rather than an uniform view. So, for example, Vietnam and Philippines were quite supportive of the Quad back then, and particularly harbored hopes on the rules-based order contribution of the Quad, particularly in the maritime order, quite understandably because of their South China Sea claims and stance. Whereas, for example, Indonesia, at that time when I did the research with Singapore's chairmanship, they showed a little bit more apprehension and concern about ASEAN centrality. And I'll get to ASEAN centrality in a minute. But I just wanted to highlight that certain views and narrative perhaps get more airtime than others, especially those that tend to be on more negative or skeptic spectrum. But that doesn't fully represent ASEAN diversity. So it's important to remember that diversity being in place. And that's my second point, which is the diversity within ASEAN has been there and will likely to increase. the similar set of views will likely to deepen, whether we're talking about AUKUS, Quad, which are sort of external issues, or we're talking even about so-called ASEAN internal issues, which is, for example, the current evolving crisis in Myanmar. We do see quite a significant spectrum of different views emerging within ASEAN, and so it's going to be a trend that is pretty hard these days to get all ASEAN uniform, unified views on almost everything or anything these days. So with the AUKUS in particular, I guess I think the opinion will be forming still. It's early days, but so far Malaysia has a little bit less positive response. It was alarming about potential arms race and issues related to non-proliferation. From Indonesia, we've heard also mixed views, some also quite concerning, some probably less. Philippines, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs had come up rather positive, and similarly in Singapore, I think it was quite a rational view and warned against any unduly alarmist. I think Vietnam has also quite rather enigmatic view with expression that all countries should exercise be responsible for stability and security in the region. But that is to say that Vietnam shares that view, that it is also feeling that, and that particularly was addressed to Australia, which acquired the submarine, nuclear-powered submarine deals within this AUKUS arrangement. And I think the comment from Vietnamese representative was that every country has responsibility to take care of its own defense and deterrence, but in a responsible way, which is not contributing to arms race. I think overall, countries will continue to observe and shape their opinion as we learn more about the AUKUS. It's still very early days. We don't know much details that this AUKUS arrangement entails, but there are some negative views, including from the Pacific. The Kiribati prime ministers come out for similar concerns about Australia contributing potentially to the arms race. So I guess diplomatically, it's not very well done from Australia part. I guess also US and the UK could have done better with signaling, but a lot of heat came to Australia. What I wanted to emphasize, though, is that while everybody refers to that arms race being the submarines, they're not going to be there in place until the 2030s or 40s. So we still have a lot to wait, but some diplomatic damage has already been done quite instantaneously. So at the moment, I think Australia is in the mode of damage control, not only with the neighboring Southeast Asians in the Pacific that have some concerns about that, but also, of course, with the French themselves. And interesting enough, there was a discussion among certain Southeast Asian countries that had different views on this new security arrangement, but the common denominator coming out from that discussion between Indonesian, Vietnamese, and Singaporean commentators was that an ask for US and its allies to be more transparent in the region, which is ironic. I've considered quite ironic given that the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy used transparent as one of its key adjectives before: open, free, transparent Indo-Pacific, but it is now that the Southeast Asians are asking the Indo-Pacific countries to be more transparent. And then it comes to the third point that I wanted to make is that AUKUS or Quad are just a symbol or representation of a new phenomenon, which is intensifying great power competition. They are just means to this broader trend, right? They come out as a manifestation of the great power competition and a result of great power competition, right? The question is, though, how ASEAN is going to respond to that. Now, ASEAN is not completely foreign to this concept. It was actually born out of the geopolitics. But the question is whether this time around, there's a new great power competition and geopolitics will define its demise. Will it die with the great power competition and geopolitics prevailing, or will it actually be able to respond in a more protective of itself manner? So the distribution of power and wealth has changed. The manners of how powers in the region interact are changing with this more intensified geopolitics, but the ASEAN modus operandi have not adopted. I think they're still largely operate as if we are in the time where great power competition was less tense, and we're still in the time of diplomacy and gathering and symmetry and peaceful cooperation. That is at least the aspiration that ASEAN wants. It doesn't want to intensify great power competition leading to conflict. It wants everybody talking to everyone. It wants to be friends with everyone. That's the predominant narrative. Now, it is a way of exercising certain narrative, but whether it is enough to constitute of ASEAN agency, I think that's an interesting question to be asking, because we will see those new minilateralists being born and an environment increasingly less conducive to inclusive multilateralism. I think powers are in a way asking to choose whether they want to admit it or not, with certain with decoupling certain bans or certain providers of, let's say, technology, 5G and whatnot are being just examples of that. So ASEAN centrality is being challenged, and ASEAN way of responding to the matters are being challenged. There's no question about that. I think it's not completely to spectrum whether ASEAN is central to everything, which is not with AUKUS and Quad being an example of, or completely failed and irrelevant, right? I think there is a spectrum in between. It's just a question whether ASEAN, as of now, it can survive this muddling through mode. And would that allow it to survive? Would that, are they just happy with the rhetorical acknowledgement of a centrality that the US, Australia, Japan, EU are pledging, or is there still, is there a willingness to honestly accept the limits? So I do think there is a scenario between completely and central to everything and ASEAN-led and ASEAN-centric architecture in the region, which we know that already is not the case, but also not completely falling to being a failed exercise. Although the challenges are mounting and can result in that if ASEAN doesn't respond adequately. And to be honest, there is a level of frustration within ASEAN member states themselves. It's not just the external powers that are asking questions of ASEAN centrality. I think internally also countries are frustrated with its own decision-making mechanism. And final, a few questions I wanted to leave with for the discussion and debate is the question, is narrative of choice, right? ASEAN keeps saying that it doesn't want to make choice between a country A and country B, US or China. But the reality, you look at historic example or a concrete example, some ASEAN countries have already made choice long time ago. For example, Thailand and Philippines being the treaty allies of US, in a way that is a choice already. It is a choice or choices. I think we are talking about whether they adhere to their previous choices or not. That's another question. And also selective choices, whether I think they will be put in a situation where a certain choices will be imposed, including, for example, the Huawei and 5G was one of the recent ones that can be quoted. At some cases, then can reconciliate and have both systems in their technology. But beyond that, I think there will be increasing examples of, for example, in trade regime as well, that there are some expectations of choice. And then also there's a question for me whether not making a choice is already a choice in itself, right? By choosing not to speak up at certain incident, for example, South China Sea or not, is a choice in itself. And you know, there is a difference between being neutral, as many countries quote when they don't want to make a choice, and there's a difference between being neutral and being neutralized. So that's a question of choice that I wanted to pose, and I do want to highlight that simple narrative of not making a choice is missing the point of what choice or choices may entail. I'll leave it at that so that we have plenty of time for discussion, and happy to engage on other issues as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hong. I think it was really excellent that you tried to decipher all these complicated and sometimes painful questions about what is ASEAN centrality, what is efficient multilateralism, and we do have to actually look at the tensions between the rhetorics of the ASEAN centrality and the efficiency of this, the symbolism versus efficiency, legitimacy versus efficiency. Kikuchi-san also talked about it. So now I will open the floor for the Q&A session. I will encourage all the panelists to react to each other presentations, of course. We do have a couple of questions already poured in, and I have also my question also that I would like to provide. So maybe we start with gathering some first points, and then we'll come back to you later on. Maybe Bruno, as you have to leave earlier, there's some questions for you. I understand that that maybe you had an exchange with David Camroux from Sciences Po Paris, that's writing a question on Myanmar specifically, but I would like to read it out loud for the audience. And so he's writing, the notion of centrality is a question of positioning, not a statement about capability. As we said, the EU, in delegating a return to democracy in Myanmar to ASEAN, seems to have confused the two, given that the military junta refuses to cooperate with the ASEAN Special Envoy on Myanmar and may be barred from the ASEAN Summit late October. What should the EU do now? That's the first question for you, Bruno. And David is also asking you, Hong, to react on this. So you're also welcome to react. And I would further ask Kikuchi-san also maybe to get his reaction on the situation in Myanmar right now, the position of Japan, how Japan is articulating his a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy with a kind of a value-based, principles-based diplomacy. How Japan is trying to support human rights, democracy in the region. That's certainly one concern also for the EU. So another question is how the EU and Japan can work together in this prospect. And more broadly, my question would be, what are the main, the most fruitful areas for cooperation, coordination between the Japan and the EU in ASEAN, within the ASEAN countries, and then with ASEAN as an institution. There's a lot of things to do, including connectivity and so on. So I would be happy to get your views on that. And maybe a last question for Huang. You talked about AUKUS and Quad and the various mixed perceptions of the ASEAN countries. Recently, we've seen the Quad changing a little bit. It's kind of nature, because first of all, it was a kind of very focused on maritime security and so on. But nowadays, there's a lot of focus on geoeconomics, including health, diplomacy, vaccine, climate change, and so on. So under this new kind of nature, do you expect some ASEAN countries at least to try to associate or to coordinate or to cooperate with the Quad at some point? What would be the condition for this? Do you think it's realistic or not, or feasible? Thanks a lot. This would be the first round of questions. So we turn to Bruno, if you have a couple of minutes for us.
Yes, thanks. Well, on Myanmar, as mentioned in the Q&A, I don't think the EU is actually delegating the issue to ASEAN. I think it would be a stretch to argue that. The EU is, I believe, consistent with the strategy in advocating for the good work and access of the ASEAN Special Envoy. It did implement several rounds of sanctions that target the economic interest of members of the junta. It supports various UN mechanisms with regards to human rights in Myanmar. It does coordinate with regional and international like-minded partners on the issue. So, in terms of positioning, which was the point made by David, and whom I thank for the question, by the way, I think it's coherent. Now, is it enough? Does it measure up to the stakes? In other terms, is there indeed a capability expectation gap? That I do not really have an answer to this, because this is a very complex. Well, it's a very complex issue. It's not just a matter of policy. It's indeed a matter of how you leverage diplomacy for the sake of values, and then interact with the political, some of the most regalian aspects of political systems abroad. So in this regard, I would be more circumspect in my answer. But overall, I see some coherence in the EU positioning and diplomatic posture. Again, I think it's a timely question.
Okay, thanks, Bruno. Do you have anything to add on the EU-Japan cooperation?
Yeah, I think that connectivity, what the EU and Japan can deliver with regards to connectivity, will be of the utmost importance with regard to the Indo-Pacific, because as much as AUKUS augments and rises the stake and gives more strategic and military intelligence and defense cooperation content to the Indo-Pacific notion, the connectivity agenda, the shared connectivity agenda between the EU, Japan, and to an extent also India, but certainly EU, Japan, has a lot of potential in giving it a more diversified, more inclusive, politically charged, economically super important content as well. So that would represent, to me, a good opportunity for regional actors, especially ASEAN, to keep some kind of grasp on the dynamics around them, meaning to maintain ASEAN centrality in a competition of models and of Indo-Pacific cooperation, and not just in Indo-Pacific concept that they do not themselves have the agency to shape. That would be perhaps in too few words, my opinion. It's an opportunity for local actors to leverage their centrality again, but at another scale. So the connectivity agenda, to me, in support of the more defense and security agenda, would be important. And in this regard, there is no other, no better, not a more developed partnership than the EU-Japan partnership. Thanks, Celine. Thanks for everything. And I'm terribly sorry, but I will have to.
I understand that you have to run to another meeting. So thanks a lot for joining today and have a good day.
Thank you and apologies.
No problem. Okay, Kikuchi-san, can you now take the floor to the questions?
Thank you. Before to respond to your question, I'll say about my own argument that we are the moving toward more multipolar Indo-Pacific. I'm not optimistic about that, but what I emphasize in my presentation, we are too much preoccupied with assumption that only big powers define the regional orders, and we are too much paid attention to U.S.-China bilateral dynamics when we talk about the future of Indo-Pacific. So there are a variety of political and economic dynamism taking place in this part of the world, not just everything relating to the U.S.-China bilateral relations. And if we look at very carefully what is going on the ground in the Indo-Pacific, we can identify quite strong elements that indicate we could, go beyond U.S.-China relations. There are quite strong elements in, Indo-Pacific, especially, Southeast Asia, to keep its own autonomy or independence, and also keep their own sovereignties, autonomy, and so forth, among the countries in Southeast Asia. So I think, we taking those, quite strong, the passion to keep its independence and autonomies, we can, this, some, let's say we can utilize those local dynamics to create more new, regional orders based on the, multipolar, multipolarities of the regional orders and so forth. That is, so I'm not, I never optimistic about that, but we should, explore the possibility of that, that's all. And on the Myanmar issues, this is a quite difficult question. And also, first priority of Japanese government on Myanmar issues to stop human tragedies, stop violence. And we have a quite strong connection with not just the democratic movement, but also military regime for last several decades. And we have a strong personal relation with the top leader of the military regime. So we have constantly, transfer our own, request to military regime, especially respect for the human rights and stop violence and so forth. But at the same time, we are Japan, in my understanding, we are Japanese government are too much preoccupied with the previous, bad experience, putting on sanctions and pressure on the military regime and pushing the Myanmar to Chinese side. So I think, little bit, it seemed to me government a bit reluctant to put pressure on the military regime because we are concerned, about repeating previous, experience, pushing Myanmar to China, Chinese side and so forth. That is my my understanding. So any other, and I'll say on quadrilateral security dialogues. I've been following the Quad since 2007. It's the first meeting, and my tentative conclusion right now is that Quad is not forum dominated or controlled by the United States. And now United States cannot decide agenda by itself. So United States are being closely consulted with other partner countries, Japan, Australia, and India. And our views have been put in the final result of the Quad considerations. So as I mentioned in my presentation, Quad could quite useful forum in terms of, first one is keep US engaged in the Indo-Pacific. Quad provide the institutional format for US engagement on the constant basis. And also Quad put some institutional constraints on the US behavior, especially against some US quite unilateral aggressive behavior against China. Because Japan, we are ally of the United States, but we are not following all US policies toward China. We are quite taking quite balancing the policies toward both US and China. The other Quad partner, the Australia, India, they are also taking quite similar positions on both to US and China. So United States now clearly understand, and the US cannot dominate the Quad agenda. So I think Quad is not fully so-called anti-China unilateral arrangement. Of course, we are by strengthening the Quad, we are sending a message to China, not take deviant behavior or not taking the coercive behavior against regional countries. So we are ready to respond once China take a deviant behavior. But we are ready to cooperate with China. We are ready to engage in with China. So it's not the anti-China the formula. So I think there are a lot of space the cooperation between Quad and other institution and also multilateral arrangement I mentioned, including ASEAN. Yeah. So I think that is quite important for ASEAN to put some ASEAN views on the process of Quad. Yeah. So by strengthening the cooperation with Quad, ASEAN can transfer their own creative views into a Quad process. Yeah. So Quad is a quite open-minded, open forum, quite flexible. Yeah. And it's not tightly organized these institutions against China. Yeah, it's a quite flexible and multi-layered process of consultations. That is my understanding. Yeah. So we need some the assessing what the Quad is right now. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kikuchi-san. And exactly this last point I would like to ask Wong to react. And maybe add one further question from Dr. Michael Reiter, who is a former EU ambassador to South Korea and elsewhere, and senior counselor with CSDS at the VUB. And he's asking you, does ASEAN get the message that its centrality is further questions? So you have this for you, Wong.
Thank you. All the fun, easy question to respond, but thanks so much for them. I think Myanmar is a tremendously difficult issue, and even though there are more activism on part of a number of ASEAN member states, I think it is increasingly clear that it's a very difficult issue to rely upon ASEAN and its centrality especially. So, you know, when it started, of course, ASEAN has issued a statement calling for restraint, and Brunei, being the chair of ASEAN, issued that statement first the day of the coup on the 1st of February. But since then, you know, we only saw very little activism and or effectiveness of activism. We had the 5-point consensus in April, but there are still remaining issues, including, you know, of recognition, representation, of whom to officially recognized, whether Tatmadaw as a representation or the opposition and UG, and that will lead also to the question of the summer summit later this month. I think you know, the immediate reaction was, oh, ASEAN has this non-interference principle, so it won't interfere or in domestic matters. But truth is, ASEAN also has the ASEAN Charter, which is a legal document saying that have provisions to the rule of law and good governance and principles of democracy and constitutional government in ASEAN member states, which they all sign up to, and also have a provision of respecting fundamental freedoms and human rights or social justice. All of those are, you know, clearly in violation by Tatmadaw. So there, you know, you have arguments on each side. The question is, you know, there isn't that really implementation mechanism. So what if those provisions within the ASEAN Charter are not met? There's no really response mechanism, and the same with the 5-point consensus. There's no timeline or, you know, how to implement them, and there's no what if, right, if it's not met. So I think it's so far the process is stopped at diplomacy and really much relying a lot on goodwill from the part of Tatmadaw and Myonglang to comply to those diplomatic measures, but what we see, it's not really what's happening. I think another important factor in this is also lack of a really you know, ASEAN unified agency. We do see different opinions within ASEAN. I mentioned Brunei being the chair, but beyond that 1st of February statement, Brunei is not leading the process really. It's Indonesia and Singapore behind the scenes. Predominantly, of course, Thailand would have some more influence, but it's also not being really exercised. Other countries have been relatively reticent on the issue. So I think that's a key question, because there's such a different diversity of opinions within ASEAN. The agency is going to be severely impeded by that. And I think, but at the same time, I do think it's one of the bigger challenges that ASEAN have had in its history, is dealing with this Myanmar crisis and not allowing it to spill over to bigger conflict, or letting Myanmar to become a failed state and therefore leave a whole big hole within the ASEAN project, including any of ASEAN political security community, economic community, or social cultural community, and even, you know, the RCEP, right, the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership, which ASEAN is sort of seen as driving. It was agreed last year under Vietnam's chairmanship. Of course, there are other extra-regional actors in part of it, but it's also seen as one of the rare examples of ASEAN agency there. But can it do it without it? Myanmar, like leaving Myanmar behind, what's going to be a question? It's going to be a question out there too, right? So Myanmar, it's increasingly complex and a hard question. One that it's there's no straightforward answer. I think it going to be continue to be passed over from this chairmanship of Brunei to next year of Cambodia and probably much longer. The question is whether we'll have the leadership within ASEAN to take up and have that diplomatic charisma to carry on and really have that reconciliation process. That a special envoy that was appointed is certainly not even having the access that he's supposed to have. So it's really hard to say at this point of time. On the Quad question, I think you asked a question whether ASEAN is willing to cooperate and kind of revise its view on Quad. I think Quad is receptive to some of ASEAN criticism, as we saw from the evolving agenda, even though it's been elevated to more prominence, including the Leaders' Summits, and probably more strategic global attention to Quad now. But I do think there is some receptiveness in terms of criticism, because Quad does emphasize, at least on rhetorical level, of ASEAN centrality, and also does put more emphasis on cooperation and kind of providing public good agenda and more foreign policy engagement, rather than being really a security partnership or defense partnership, the way, at least even now, AUKUS looks like, right, with the submarine and technology transfer and stuff like that. So the Quad is transferring into more of engagement of public and providing public goods. A lot of that is to address to ASEAN, to Southeast Asia itself. For example, the vaccine partnership, right? The Quad members have now released a website that shows how it contributes to vaccines, and a lot of that is centrally really in Southeast Asia. Quad is working on an infrastructure, technology, and maritime security. So really, responding to ASEAN needs or Southeast Asian needs in that respect. And when for example, vaccine partnership was announced, I don't think there was any objection within Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia would happily accept the vaccine donations from the Quad partnership. Of course, there's a bit of time lag there, but in this kind of scenario, there's no question about centrality or overshadowing ASEAN. So really, it's what it comes to be in practical, real terms, rather than or our imagination of whatever arrangement Quad or AUKUS can be. So I think being responsive to the needs and being able to communicate them well do help in both regards. To Michael's question, hi Michael, about centrality. I do think that there is, of course, centrality is just a code word about what about us. I think at the outset, very beginning, ASEAN centrality was never a very well-defined concept, and it has different interpretation within ASEAN itself already. So when certain commentaries say that Quad or AUKUS overshadow ASEAN centrality, it's a very reductionist way of looking at centrality, right? I personally don't think that ASEAN centrality is being exercised or guaranteed by absence of other arrangements, other institutions, or other minilaterals. I don't think such positioning is correct. That ASEAN can't claim centrality or being overshadowed because of other institutions. There are plenty of them. Some other minilateralism, some of Southeast Asian countries are members. They are the ones that they are not. But the key is whether ASEAN and to what degree ASEAN is able to establish relationship with those institutions, whether be them global, multilateral, or minilateral. Yeah, so it's essential for ASEAN survival and well-being in the broader regional and global architecture is how it develops relationship with other institutions, including minilaterals. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, did I miss out on anything?
I think it's good. Thanks a lot, Hong, for the very, very complete answers. We are already running out of time, actually.
Wow.
So I see, Kikuchi-san, you wanted to add something. If you have a very
Yeah, just,
super quick
just,
remark.
on the ASEAN centrality concept. So I hope, ASEAN take more concrete actions to demonstrate how ASEAN centrality worked for regional peace and stability. And in that context, I think, ASEAN adopted the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific just 2 years ago, but not yet implemented. So I hope, ASEAN other institutions, push the implementation of the, ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific with, outside partners. That is quite, useful to demonstrate how ASEAN centrality work for regional peace and stability. Because, ASEAN outlook has been, tried to change it, the narrative of Indo-Pacific from competition to cooperations. So ASEAN, I hope ASEAN demonstrate how ASEAN could, change the discourse of Indo-Pacific from competition to cooperation, in cooperation with other countries. Yeah. So other countries are ready to cooperate with ASEAN. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Kikuchi-san. I really need now to end our panel with much regret. So thanks a lot to our excellent panelists. The good news is that the discussion is continuing for the second session. So we will reconvene approximately in 7 or 8 minutes from now. So very, very short break. Sorry for this. But stay tuned. Other great speaker and my colleague Eva will moderate the session and we continue to discuss on all this. Thanks a lot again to you, Hong, and to Kikuchi-san and Bruno, who is already somewhere else. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Be back soon. Yeah.
Welcome back. I hope you managed to get a coffee over this very short break. And I hope you enjoyed the first session of our exciting discussion on the EU, Japan, and ASEAN. How does multilateralism still fit in this increasingly fragmented regional architecture that we are witnessing and many shockwaves that we've been through. My name is Eva Teixeira and I have the pleasure to co-lead the Japan program at the VUB together with Céline Pajon that you have just heard. The aim of the Japan program is to specifically steer this debate on security issues in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe and beyond. The way we structured this webinar was to look at the engagement of extra-regional powers, Japan and the European Union here specifically, with ASEAN, but also to look at how ASEAN views this engagement from inside out. And that is precisely what the second session is about. But before I pass the floor to the discussant of the second session, it is a real honor to be able to be joined by a figure, a distinguished figure on Southeast Asia, East Asian security affairs, Ambassador Rizal Sukma. I believe Ambassador doesn't really need that much introduction to anyone who has been following East Asian security affairs and East Asian affairs in general. This name is not unknown. Dr. Rizal Sukma is currently Senior Fellow at the Indonesian Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, but he was also Indonesia's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the International Maritime Organization. I won't go into details of his distinguished CV. Rather than that, I would pass the floor directly to him for his wise words in a keynote address. Ambassador Sukma, can I pass you the floor now?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First of all, of course, I would like to thank, for the invitation, to share, my thought, and thank you also Eva for moderating this session. I'm sure this is going to be, one of those, memorable and very important and also interesting webinar so far, on these emerging, complicated security challenges, in Indo-Pacific. I will only touch upon, three main issues. Number one, of course, like, in the term of reference, I asked, how, ASEAN countries actually look at or perceive, the extra regional powers. And here, it's very difficult. Actually, there is no one single, ASEAN perception of the extra regional powers, because ASEAN member states, they differ, in terms of, the threat perception. They also differ with regard to the nature of each, extra regional power. And some, see certain powers as the source of problem. Some would see that, another extra regional powers as source of opportunity, and so on. And also, actually, this kind of perception also change, from time to time. So it's a very difficult to pinpoint. This is the main characteristic of ASEAN perception of extra regional powers. So that's, I think, explain, I mean, later on, we can use this to understand why, ASEAN member states differ, with regard to their responses to the outbursts. But there is one thing that unite, all the Southeast Asian countries, I think, when it comes to the extra regional powers. No ASEAN member state, would like to see the region, turn into a place where these extra regional powers, especially US and China, compete, for influence. I don't think that any member state, of ASEAN really want to see the return of 1970s and 1980s, to Southeast Asia. But, I will come back to this point later on, how ASEAN ensure that, of course, subject to debate and also has been, subject to, I think, deep thinking, within ASEAN itself. So it's easy to say that we don't want this competition in our region, but at the same time, we still not sure how, we can actually achieve that and how we can ensure that great powers or major powers will not compete, in Southeast Asia. One point, within this, I think, issue on the perception of the extra regional powers, and then how ASEAN has dealt with the extra regional powers in the past. So I think because, we are worried about this implication of the competition among the major powers in the past, especially 70s and 80s, the strategy that ASEAN uses is actually try to keep the major powers out. So that's why we came up with ZOFAN, the zone of peace, neutrality, and so on. So we want the extra regional powers to be out. So, by trying to keep them outside, then, Southeast Asia will not, will continue to be peaceful and so on. But it didn't work, so because, I think the major powers, were here in the regions, and also, of course, they also have, interest. So that's why after the end of the Cold War, ASEAN changed, its, strategy. So we try to keep them in, so that's why, we created the ASEAN Plus 3, if you recall, at that time in 1997, and then, the East Asia Summit, and then, we invited, all these extra regional powers to be part of that, ASEAN-centered institution. Whether this, is working, I'm still, I think it's not sure. But, I think I would say the outcomes of this strategy, has been quite mixed. But now, I think the challenge again, for ASEAN to really demonstrate that, they can actually navigate, these difficult terrains of major powers relationship in the regions. So now let's move to the very specific, I think, challenge that not only Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN face, but also all of us in the world, which is the growing, strategic rivalry, between US and China. Within that context, I think the ASEAN core strategic interests vis-a-vis great powers remain unchanged. So I think ASEAN still like to say that our core strategic interests are actually maintaining centrality and strategic autonomy. So maintaining these two things will continue to be a top priority for ASEAN. And achieving these two strategic priorities requires ASEAN to prevent marginalization, to preserve unity, and of course, sustain ASEAN relevance. So this is, I think, overwhelming, challenge that, ASEAN face at the moment, because now we see these great powers actually are competing, especially in terms of shaping the emerging regional order, in the Indo-Pacific. So it's not only, they're competing, for influence in the regions, but also they're competing to shape the emerging regional order. So that's why, we are witnessing the different visions, competing visions of regional order in Indo-Pacific at the moment. Yes, I agree with Kikuchi-san, when he basically said that there's a lot of agency as well, among the regional powers, but unfortunately, at the end, it is great powers, that shape and construct regional order. So that's why, the Quad happened, and then, it's also AUKUS, happened. So this is, I think, the proof that, if the regional countries, cannot actually provide a certain, framework that really accommodate, differing interests, of the extra-regional powers, then at the end, the regional power, the extra-regional powers will try to shape, that particular regional order. So in that context, I think ASEAN has failed the first test, in managing the US-China rivalry. The absence of effective multilateral security framework, I think, the one that allowed this AUKUS, to happen. So because it's very clear that dialogues and norm shaping that have become, the center of ASEAN activities is not enough. So because states at the end are driven by the logic of balance of power, and within that context, I think it's fair to say that ASEAN could not manage, the growing tension between China and Australia. So that's why, I think Australia also at the end had to take, realistic, a decision, to actually defend what they see their core interest, which is under, at least perceived under a threat, from China. So the third point that I would like to also emphasize is actually the questions that, all of us ask, what concrete policies and measures would be, most needed, in the regions, especially, to improve the multilateralism, in the regions. So in short, it's basically the question, what can ASEAN do? So I think the conversation in the first session really revolved around that question, what can ASEAN do? So let's begin by defining what we want first. I mean, what ASEAN wants first. ASEAN definitely wants the US and China to cooperate, not compete. So I think Kikuchi-san already alluded to the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN, I think quite ambitious. When they stated this, they want to turn the competition between the US and China into cooperation. So it's basically ASEAN wants the US and China to cooperate, not to compete. The question is really, can we do that? Can ASEAN, do that? I don't think they can. No, ASEAN cannot do that because compete and cooperate are the two things that great powers will do. Great powers will compete, but at the same time, they will also cooperate when, the need, arise. So in that context, I think what ASEAN can really do is not to transform this competition into cooperations, but, I think there are two things that, we can focus on. Number one, to provide a platform, for ASEAN, for US and China to moderate the competition and focus and intensify the cooperation. The second one is to moderate the possible impacts of the competition, on ASEAN member state, especially with regard to this pressure, to choose, whether they will side with the US or they will side with with China. So that's, I think ASEAN can do that, by, say, doing three things: revise, reform, and restraint. Revise, I think this is related to the questions of capacity and effectiveness of ASEAN as regional institution. So it needs to revise the charter. So there are ASEAN charter. There are a number of, I think, points that is important for ASEAN to revise. Number one, of course, the decision-making process. Number two, on the questions of funding. Number three, on the mechanism to respond to crisis. I'm part of those groups who criticize ASEAN for not being able to respond to the crisis in Myanmar, because the charter doesn't have any provisions on how to respond to the crisis by ASEAN. And then also we need to revise the charter to include regime sanctions, because without sanction there is no use to have rules. Rules will work if you do have also sanction regimes in place. Number two, reform. What do we need to reform? I think we all need to reform the East Asia Summit. So we tend to forget that East Asia Summit is the only multilateral institution in the regions where all the actors has a seat around the table. So it is important to actually institutionalize the East Asia Summit. So this is a very sensible thing for ASEAN to do. There have been a lot of ideas out there that we can try to consolidate and then try to discuss it with other members of the East Asia Summit outside ASEAN. Two important, I think, proposals are out there. Number one, we need also to create, for example, Sherpa, to set the agenda for the East Asia Summit. Number two, it should not be dominated by ASEAN member states only. So the chairmanship should be shared, between ASEAN and non-ASEAN members of the East Asia Summit. So a sense of, ownership, will be created. So that's, I think, things that we need to, to think about and then probably reform with regard to the East Asia Summit. The final things is that actually restraint. So ASEAN cannot do much except, reminding all the great powers, all the major powers, to exercise restraint, because restraint is a very, important, especially when great powers, get locked into the spiral of competition and also rivalry. So we need to remind them, whenever you have a problem, take it to the East Asia Summit. If you have, some quarrels, take it to the East Asia Summit. But that will require East Asia Summit to be institutionalized further, in other words, to be reformed. So here, I think the EU and Japan, can play a very important role, because they are part of this Asia Summit. We need to also work together in order to come up with ideas on how that we can really strengthen the East Asia Summit to become a premier regional multilateral framework and processes where we can try to say address all the challenges that we face in the regions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. These were extremely wise words. I remember reading your op-ed in the Jakarta Times where you said that ASEAN wants to be friends with both, and it depends on US and China whether they what sort of positions they would take. It was a main takeaway. But I couldn't agree more on the East Asia Summit. It seems a little bit like the ASEAN Regional Forum with the chairmanship rotating and co-organizing, etc. I should probably add that the European Union, wants to be part of the East Asia Summit, but is not yet really a member. So perhaps that's something to be thought about. And definitely the EU, Japan, and ASEAN. From your speech, you could only see how much in common we have in the face of the US-China rivalry and the kind of visions that we have for the region in general. But I'm sure that we will get back more to many of the points that you raised in our discussion. So it is my pleasure now to invite our three distinguished speakers, Professor Ralph Emmers, Dr. Tomotaka Shoji, and Dr. Lai Hui Yo from Singapore to open their cameras. Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Again, three famous names to anyone who has been following regional affairs, friends, I must say colleagues that we've been seeing over and over the years. And Dr. Ralph Emmers is the Dean of Singapore's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and has been writing, publishing, commenting extensively about regional affairs, and especially on multilateralism and ASEAN-centered multilateralism in the region. Dr. Tomotaka Shoji, currently a fellow at the Japanese NITS, the National Institute for Defense Studies, again, an expert on Southeast Asian affairs. Thank you very much for joining us. And finally, but not least, Dr. Lai Hui Yo, the director of the EU Center in Singapore. Dr. Lai Hui has been perhaps the prophetic voice on EU-ASEAN relations in Singapore, in the region. So I'm very much looking forward to your input. But if I may start with Ralph, Professor Emmers, please, well, as an expert on the region, based in the region, but as a European yourself, how do you see the main challenges in the current debate for ASEAN, and what could be Europe's role in this very complicated debate? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva, and I would like to thank the organizers. Thank you, everybody, and wonderful to see so many friends online. I hope you can hear me well from a sunny afternoon in Singapore. Just to confirm, I have about 8-9 minutes to cover those topics.
Perfect. Just initial remarks, a maximum 10 minutes. Yes, please.
Okay, great. All right. So essentially what I would like to do is to cover three areas. The first one would be ASEAN's geopolitical challenges. And here Rizal has made my life so much easier because I agree with everything he has said. So I will just highlight some points. I will then focus on ASEAN's perception of the EU. And finally, focus on what ASEAN expects from the organization, especially when it comes to Indo-Pacific security. So let me start with the geopolitical challenges. So as mentioned, ASEAN has very much built an institutional architecture that includes all the major and middle powers, including, of course, a very pivotal organization, the European Union. And this is done through an overlapping architecture, including the East Asia Summit that does not include the EU, but perhaps in the future, the ASEAN Regional Forum that does include the EU, and finally the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, which again, sadly, at this point does not yet include the European Union. So the strategy is simple. You lock in as many external powers as possible, and you make them commit to Southeast Asian security, with a very simple objective is to not be left with just one external power. So it's a form of institutional balancing. It's a form of balance of power through institutional means. You bring everybody in, you make them commit to Southeast Asian security to avoid a scenario where just one power dominates Southeast Asia. I think it's important to stress that some level of competition between the great powers actually works well for Southeast Asia. Because it provides some room for maneuver and flexibility for the association. It means that ASEAN can hedge between the great powers and leverage their influence. The problem, and that's the problem we're facing today, is once this competition becomes too assertive, leading to a point where ASEAN can no longer restrict their interference in Southeast Asian affairs. And of course, this is especially true when it comes to the South China Sea dispute. So it is very hard for the moment for ASEAN to be both at the center of this architecture while still staying clear from managing their competition. And I think that's the dilemma that ASEAN is facing at the moment. There is also the risk of the architecture to become pretty much irrelevant, leading to alternatives to emerge. And I think we are seeing an alternative architecture emerging at the moment, structured around the Quad and AUKUS. And what's important is that the philosophy of this architecture is completely different. The ASEAN architecture is based on cooperative security. It's based on, I talk to my potential enemies. I do not exclude anyone. The Quad and AUKUS obviously does exclude. and obviously seems to be based on the notion of constraining China, at least militarily. So let me now zoom in on the European Union. Where does the EU as a dialogue partner come in? And to what extent can the EU soften some of those challenges that ASEAN faces? So let me start with perception. How is the EU still perceived in Southeast Asia? And I think here I would make 3 points. The first one, and it's not going to be surprising to anyone in Brussels, is that the EU is still mostly regarded as a trading partner, much more than as a political or security actor. And this, of course, is due to very good reasons. The EU is a huge trading partner of most Southeast Asian countries and of ASEAN as a region. So that's on the plus side. On the minus side, it's of course the EU sometimes coming across as fragmented, not having its business, security, and normative interests nicely aligned. It's also the result of ASEAN states often dealing bilaterally with individual European members rather than with the European Union as an organization. And finally, of course, there is geography. That's something that we cannot change. And the fact that the result is that sometimes the two regions can misunderstand each other when it comes to security and political affairs. That said, I think the EU still regards the European Union as a partial, and I really stress partial, model of regional integration. It remains, despite the differences, an organization that ASEAN follows very carefully, especially in terms of finding the right, pick and choosing the right level of balance in the EU approach to integration. While ASEAN, of course, preserves a very intergovernmental approach and strict reading of sovereignty. Finally, because I want to end that particular section on a positive note, when it comes to perception, I think increasingly the EU is perceived in Southeast Asia as a relevant strategic partner in a multipolar world. And this perhaps much more than even 5 or 10 years ago, post financial crisis that hit Europe so badly. So I think now, with the re-emergence of great power competition, the EU is increasingly being observed as this multilateral power that speaks the same language as the language that ASEAN wants to speak. So here I'm referring to the European Union as a norm setter, not just in international trade, but also increasingly in new areas like cyberspace. And I think this is where the EU is being regarded much more positively than, again, just a few years ago, because the neighborhood has become so much more complex. Additionally, I think, as you know, in Southeast Asia, we don't really make a distinction between economic security and traditional security. They are two facets of the same coin. And I believe increasingly the European Union is viewed as a potential economic counterbalance to what would otherwise be Chinese dominance in the region. Not alone, of course, together with Japan, with the United States and others. But I think it's important to stress that the EU is in that group of actors to be viewed as an economic counterbalancer to what otherwise would be a very one-way relationship with China. So let me now conclude by looking at expectations. So perceptions is one part. What is ASEAN expecting? And of course, here I'm completely speaking on my own behalf. I'm not in any way representing the views coming from the Secretariat, but a couple of points. Again, starting on a positive note, I think there is a deep expectation of further deepening of EU-ASEAN trade links. And again, we should not forget, in Southeast Asia, we don't make a distinction between trade and security. They come hand in hand. So the fact that ASEAN continues to explore for new partnerships and the opening of new markets clearly means that the European Union is very much on top of that list with some other actors. And again, China comes to mind. The fact that questions are now being raised about the health of the Chinese economy is important, because again, ASEAN is looking for alternatives. The fact that the EU has already concluded free trade agreements with Singapore, Vietnam, and is under negotiations with the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, I think is a very positive, again, development in terms of expectations of the relationship. Yet, still limited prospects, I believe, of an ASEAN-EU strategic partnership. That doesn't seem to be there due to a series of issues. Again, I could stress geography. I could stress the fact that the EU is again not yet a member of, for instance, the East Asia Summit. And if the East Asia Summit were to become that central pillar of the Indo-Pacific security, then that is, of course, a very significant issue. Another one, which is perhaps a little bit more sensitive, but important to stress, EU's role as a norm setter sometimes also complicates relations with ASEAN, especially when it comes to the promotion of human rights, when it comes to the issue of Myanmar, the imposition of continued EU sanctions on Myanmar in 2021, despite ASEAN members, some ASEAN members advising against it. So the norm setting element is a double-edged sword. Let me, however, because I want to be positive on this day, let me conclude by highlighting two areas where I think ASEAN and the European Union can do more together. One is I see an even greater convergence of mutual interest in non-traditional security topics. It's a lingo, it's a lexicon, which is now very familiar, both in ASEAN and in the European Union. So great areas of convergence could include sustainability and climate change, research and innovation, especially in areas like COVID-19, pandemics, and climate science, convergence of rules and norms in the digital sphere, and also, of course, ongoing efforts in counterterrorism, which both in Europe and ASEAN has often been addressed in a very different way from what you experienced during the Bush years, for instance, in the United States. You did not have that same level of securitization going on. A second area of cooperation in the years to come would be in preventive diplomacy, especially in the maritime domain. I am often tired of listening to critics of the European Union asking me how many aircraft carriers can the EU send to the South China Sea. Well, to me, it looks like we already have too many aircraft carriers in that part of the world. I think what is required is more diplomacy, and especially more preventive diplomacy. And again, this is where I think, as a normative power, the European Union and ASEAN can actually work together by playing this role of being a norm entrepreneur and a social persuader through the ERF. Now, we shouldn't be naive. There are massive headwind to such an approach. But I do believe that such an approach has not been sufficiently used and is increasingly being sidelined. And I think this is where the EU has a lot to bring to ASEAN in its attempt to managing the situation. So Eva, I would like to end on that half full glass approach, and I look forward to questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph, and we can fill the glass a little bit more later. You're speaking from my heart when you know on preventive diplomacy and maritime security. That's all the issues that we've been trying to work towards too. But listening to your last part when you mentioned climate research, digital, counterterrorism, and I'm turning now to Professor Shoji. isn't these precisely the topic that constitute the EU-Japan strategic partnership? That's pretty much the list that we've been creating with Japan, and it seems that there is a great convergence precisely in kind of a more triangular, if you want, cooperation between the EU-Japan in engaging with ASEAN. So what would be your views from Tokyo, and trying to kind of reverse your views? How do you see that the Japanese engagement is perceived in ASEAN, and what could be eventually the opportunity for cooperation?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Eva. Can I share my slides with participants?
Sure. Is it? Can you do it yourself? Can you see the share?
Yes,
function?
sure. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank Eva and Celine for inviting me to such a very interesting and important workshop virtually. My name is Shoji. I'm from the National Institute for Japan Studies of Japan. Actually, the presentation topic I was given for this workshop is how does ASEAN regard Japan? I'm not from ASEAN, I'm from Japan. So this short presentation is how ASEAN regards Japan, just as I imagine from a Japanese perspective. Okay, oh, sorry. So first of all, let's see some of the survey conducted by ICD in Singapore. This slide shows that Japan and the EU are regarded as significant third parties for ASEAN in terms of hedging against the US-China strategic rivalry. Interestingly, both Japan and the EU are not neutral third parties within the context of the US-China or strategic rivalry. Japan, like many major powers of the EU, is a US ally, supporting the US vision on a free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP. Also, as we talked a lot already, Japan is a member of Quad. So in this regard, Japan is clearly on the US side. And according to another interesting question of the survey, about 2/3 of the respondents trust Japan. Moreover, the trust level is increasing in this year's survey in comparison to the previous year. So of course, I'm feeling happy to know that Japan is greatly trusted by ASEAN. However, I'm curious about, and I should elaborate more on what being trusted is. So the survey says that Japan does the right thing, and the strongest reason is Japan is a responsible or stakeholder that respects and champions international law. Actually, personally, I'm not so sure whether Japan is more active than other regional players in championing international law. But anyway, according to the survey, ASEAN seems to believe so. How should I interpret this? My interpretation is that ASEAN hopes to keep the current regional order based on rule of law led by the United States. However, amid the US-China confrontation and considering the economic benefits given by cooperation with China, ASEAN, of course, cannot take sides. This is sort of famous ASEAN's dilemma between US and China and between security and economy. So facing this dilemma, ASEAN might think Japan is an appropriate supporter of the current regional order to ASEAN because Japan also pursues and supports inclusive economic multilateralism like RCEP, including China. So the ASEAN expects Japan to officially support the current regional order along with the United States. and tacitly support economic multilateralism, including China, while ASEAN can avoid taking sides between US and China. So in this regard, Japan is expected to play a very challenging role in striking a difficult balance in regional politics and security. So, this is about what being trusted is. So here is another point of view. I'd like to clarify how significant Japan is to ASEAN. First, Japan has cooperated with ASEAN bilaterally and multilaterally for a long time. In the 1970s, Japan became ASEAN's dialogue partner. Since then, Japan has consistently supported ASEAN's resilience, unity, and centrality. Second, Japan's FOIP, which is a little bit different from the US FOIP, as one of its three pillars focuses on connectivity. In this regard, Japan provides ASEAN with an alternative in terms of infrastructure development, while ASEAN pursues cooperation with China in China's vision of BRI. Third, Japan is playing a significant role in the South China Sea. Japan officially endorses the 2016 arbitral ruling, as well as promoting capacity building support to ASEAN claimants. And finally, with regard to the counter-COVID measures, recently Japan is implementing its own vaccine diplomacy. In addressing the pandemic, Japan is trying to provide ASEAN with a third option. So what does ASEAN expect from Japan? What kind of role ASEAN can expect Japan to play is, I think, basically compatible to what Japan has done so far in cooperation with ASEAN. So like the promoting Japan's FOIP, mainly focusing on developing connectivity and economies, regional economies. And with regard to the South China Sea, Japan should continue to support politically to ASEAN in terms of the reinforcing multilateralism, as well as the continue to support bilaterally to ASEAN claimants. And in terms of the ASEAN's multilateralism, Japan should support continuously ASEAN centrality. And also in terms of the topic of this workshop, Japan should pursue the cooperation with EU in cooperation with ASEAN. So we can find many fields like as we talked already, like the connectivity and also the political support to ASEAN, insecurity like the South China Sea, so on. But finally, I should mention some prospects and challenges ahead. First, Japan is actively participating in Quad security cooperation, as we all know. While I think, generally speaking, ASEAN is skeptical and concerned about Quad. Therefore, the more Japan is active in Quad, the less Japan might be reliable to ASEAN. Because ASEAN wants Japan to be a mediator between US and China. Although we all know Japan is a US ally. And the ASEAN might think that Japan is too involved in a US-led coalition. So in this regard, it might be a great challenge for Japan to strike an appropriate balance, not like between the US and China, but rather than that, between ASEAN and US. Secondly, the problem of the middleware approach. I think Myanmar is a case which shows sort of ineffectiveness of Japan's middleware approach. With regard to the Myanmar issue in the 2000s, Japan engaged both the military junta and the NLD sort of the democracy promotion faction. However, with regard to their current situation in Myanmar, it's much harder for Japan to put itself in a middle position because the strife between the conflicting parties in Myanmar is so intensified that Japan cannot play an effective role of mediation. And finally, domestically, I'd like to mention Japan's political stability. This might be an issue. Prime Minister Kishida has a more consolidated power base than the previous Prime Minister Suga, but Kishida will face an election soon. He must win the election. If he loses, the Kishida administration might be weakened. Then it will be difficult for Kishida to devote his political resources to foreign policy. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shoji. This again gives me a lot of questions, but before we open the Q&A session, last words by Lai Hui Yo on the possible EU's, on the view of European Union, of course, in Europe in large, and how do you think that perhaps this Europe-Japan partnership could also, does it somehow, from the ASEAN perspective, play in favor of the EU's, of the view of the EU, that it is somehow already incorporated in the regional architecture through its partnerships with India and Japan, and does it offer more incentives perhaps to ASEAN countries to cooperate further with Europeans? What is your thinking on this? Like we?
Thank you, Eva. And good morning to all in Brussels, and good afternoon to all those in Asia. My internet connection is not very stable. I don't know whether you can hear me. I couldn't hear much of some of the discussion that went on just now. But anyway, let me say that as the last speaker, I think it's going to be a very hard act to follow after hearing all these very insightful presentations by the various panelists. And I think what I can only do is perhaps to just echo and reiterate some of the important points that have already been made in the discussion that especially from people like Rizal and everyone else. Let me say just to talk about the perceptions of the EU, which Ralph has shared about the EU being seen primarily as a trade and investment and development partner in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia. But that has changed, I think, over the years. This sort of one-sided view of the EU has actually begun, I think, to shift, and as Hong also said, there's always a diversity of views in ASEAN, right? So when we in this panel discussion, I think there are three things we have to keep on reminding ourselves about ASEAN centrality. What is it really? ASEAN diversity, the fact that there is no one ASEAN view in many of the one united view, except for what Rizal say about the one thing that unites us is that we don't want to be dominated and become pawns in this game of big power rivalry. I think that's the only thing that everyone sort of very clear about. But how to go about that, how to respond to all these challenges, I think there are different nuances. Similarly, about the view of the EU, I think the views started to shift, I would say, in the second decade of the 21st century. I think this modest change in views came because of two reasons. First, I think there's a much more concerted diplomatic effort by the EU to project itself as a comprehensive security actor, and of course its acknowledgement of ASEAN centrality in the various Asia-Pacific security architectures. I think that's very important, and as Bruno has said, as its first point, that the EU continues to recognize ASEAN centrality. And I think that's an important message to bear in mind for what ASEAN and EU should do moving forward. Second is, of course, we know that by the second decade of this 21st century, China's assertive diplomacy and aggressive actions in the South China Sea, of course, put it at odds with a few of the ASEAN claimant states, and we know specifically Vietnam and Philippines. And I think thus within ASEAN, some of the states such as Vietnam became much more open towards engaging the EU in a more comprehensive security dialogue, particularly on issues such as maritime security. So as tensions between the US and China continue to rise and the US pivot from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, ASEAN, of course, we have been taught risk being sidelined, right, with AUKUS and all that. The creation of new structures such as the Quad and AUKUS would clearly undermine ASEAN centrality. ASEAN-led regional architectures such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit are losing their shine. And so, like what Rizal said, if nothing is done to rejuvenate or reform these institutions, I think, again, like what Hong would say, where would ASEAN be in terms of its relevance and to be able to so-called maintain this centrality, not only as a rhetorical or as a facade, but really some centrality of substance. This is why I would argue, again, this is my wish list, but I'm not sure, this is shared by all the ASEAN members. My wish list for ASEAN and EU to work together is to bring the EU into all these various ASEAN-led regional architectures, right? The East Asia Summit that Rizal has talked about. I think this would also be a very important gesture towards acknowledging the fact that the EU and ASEAN are now strategic partners. Their dialogue partnership had been elevated to a strategic partnership last December. So I think it's time for ASEAN to really acknowledge that this is to put some substance into this strategic partnership. I think what is even more important for ASEAN is to work with the EU and also, of course, Japan to ensure that US-Sino rivalry is not the only narrative in the region. I think like what Kikuchi-san said, Professor, the Indo-Pacific is more than the US and China. And no doubt we cannot run away from the fact that there is this strategic rivalry going on. We should work together to reinforce and reiterate the need for a more collaborative and inclusive multilateral framework focused on collective endeavors to confront the various non-traditional security challenges that Ralph has talked about, and to work to bring about sustainable peace and development in the region. So I think we should work together to offer a different narrative than the one that constantly harp on the competition and the tensions and the rivalry. I think there's need to offer a bit more optimism and a different narrative to move the other actors towards a different path. I think the EU on 16 September presented its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And I think the EU strategy calls on its strength as a committed multilateral actor with an open, inclusive, and collaborative approach towards the region. I think this is a great contrast to AUKUS, which is all about hard power and military alliance directed against China. And I'm even not sure that underlying this AUKUS is, to me, a very subtle message that might not have been seen. Perhaps it is some way to show that the US is actually outsourcing its security role to Australia as its deputy sheriff. And is that in some way an implicit kind of withdrawal of the US, if you may want to read it that way, right? So it is not saying that I'm going to lean on my allies to do more, and I'm not going to be really putting my focus. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to present a different view of how AUKUS can be construed. But again, what is heartening in the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is the continued acknowledgement of ASEAN centrality. But as Hong pointed out, this centrality can only be maintained if ASEAN becomes more cohesive and continues the path of deepening economic integration. And this is where I think Ralph's point about trade being an important aspect of this security, because they are very much the same side of the coin, or very important when it comes to the security of the region, that the ASEAN continues its path of development and continue, and only through this economic integration, strengthening is working together, that you can come up with a much more cohesive ASEAN that can take on a much more central role in the various in the region. So I think an economically vibrant and dynamic ASEAN, only an economically vibrant and dynamic ASEAN can become a much more relevant player. So I just want to conclude by saying we should not let the US-Sino rivalry dominate our conversations all the time. We need to be aware that when we are together with the other partners, we need to focus on what we can do together that are mutually beneficial and that could have a more positive impact on the overall development of the Indo-Pacific region. So I think on that note, to be more positive, I think we have this difficult situation in Myanmar, for instance, and I think that is very much needed for the EU and ASEAN to keep on engaging in consultation and dialogue on how we can try and deliver some kind of humanitarian assistance to Myanmar when needed, when the window opens up, I think. And I think those are some issues that we could continue to work on. And I think, again, I want to end by reiterating that there's need for EU and ASEAN to really put more substance into a strategic partnership, and we can start, as Rob has said, also to focus on, although our norms are slightly different, but I think we can perhaps in some way continue to emphasize the norms of sovereign equality and the norms of trying to resolve conflicts peacefully, rather than through preventive diplomacy, rather than through any kind of violence or conflict. So I think I will end there, and we can have some discussions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lai Hui. I don't know if you can still hear us. You froze, at least on my screen. You're back. Excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks to all the three of you, and of course to Ambassador Sukma. It seems to me that at least here, we all seem to agree on a couple of elementary things, that ASEAN needs to stick and wants to stick to this middle way. It doesn't want to be driven apart or dictated by either the US and China, that it needs to stay dynamic, it needs to reform perhaps some of its institutions, and that it is rather willing to work with some of those like-minded partners, such as the EU and Japan in our specific context. And one way would be to include them more institutionally, if you want, in this broader security architecture in the making, if we're still in there. But I'll go straight to the questions. And if you allow me, well, grouping somehow related to what Ambassador Sukma kind of hit upon a very sensitive note, it seems. The EU membership in the East Asia Summit. As you know, that in Brussels, you would probably have, quite a few people cheering in the back, saying this is something that we've been, of course, striving for. But there is, I suppose, one of those people would be Michael Reiter, who's also in the audience. Hi, Michael. And Michael actually, carries on this voice, saying who would be, in your view, the ASEAN country, or who within ASEAN would support the EU integration? And if I may follow up on this somehow, in general, and perhaps also to other panelists, do you really see an appetite in more generally within ASEAN countries, and perhaps what would be the biggest obstacles to this? You know, some of the extra regional players, would they be okay with EU entering in a more institutional way the regional security architecture? So that's one question, primarily to Ambassador Sukma, but of course to all of you. The second comes from David Cambrou. I presume still for Ambassador Sukma, is there any difference as perceived in Jakarta between the Trump and the Biden administration in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia? My second kind of big question, and again, you can unwrap it as you wish, is AUKUS related. I mean, we spoke about it, like we have spoken about it quite extensively. It brings me to question, well, we've heard voices in the region and in Europe saying that with AUKUS basically demonstrates the fact that this middle way is simply not realistic. That we may be, you know, going around and preaching the middle way, but it demonstrates clearly that at the end of the road, we will need to choose. So how do you see, because we all seem to agree on wanting to push the middle way, but do you really see the impact of AUKUS as something as major as you know, being an inhibitor of our efforts? And perhaps one specifically to our Japanese intervenant, Professor Shoji, do you think that Japan is willing, and how eventually, to adjust its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in reaction to AUKUS? Or how is that perceived somewhere in Japan? So I covered Ambassador Sukma, Lai, and our Japanese participants, and perhaps one in that case for Ralph, if you mind. Cambodian presidency. You mentioned trade being, and Lai agrees, you mentioned trade being perhaps one line of cooperation that needs to be strengthened between the EU and ASEAN. I couldn't agree more, but we know that there are obvious obstacles along the way. Now that the Cambodian presidency is being prepared, do you see that perhaps it's a right time, or how could that anyhow evolve? Who wants to start? Ambassador, would you like to?
Sure, thank you. Let me briefly answer the first question, regarding the role of the EU within the multilateral setting of the Indo-Pacific. Well, when we talk about multilateral setting in the Pacific, basically it's all ASEAN-centered institutions. So I think, as I mentioned, earlier, so it's very important we take the first step, which is actually to rethink the whole things about the EAS. Because in my view, EAS is not an organization that requires, the strict membership and so on. It's basically a platform to coordinate, the interests and also areas of cooperation. So you can't use EAS as a place where you cooperate, So cooperation within the Indo-Pacific can actually take, either through a small group or even, a bigger group. It really depends on the issue areas that you want to work on. So the East Asia Summit should continue to be the leaders-led. It's a strategic forum where all the leaders actually discuss, critical, issues. So it's basically a coordination forum. So within that context, so there should not be this debate. EU can be a member of EAS, after ASEAN become a member of EU. So because this is not organization in that sense. So I think as the Indo-Pacific now is becoming the real geopolitical entity or a center gravity, so then I think all the actors, need to be accommodated and can, actually have a role, to play, within that, space, a strategic space that, I think will be the focus of many countries in the future. So that's my response to the EU and the AS. But until, I think we know exactly what function and then what are the institutions that we need to turn the EAS into, then, I think it would be too early, too premature, to talk about, which are the countries that need to be part of that, process. The second question from Pak David, yes, well, I would say that, I think not much different in terms of the policy so far on certain, areas. Well, of course, under Trump, we did from Jakarta, we didn't see that the US really pay, full attention to Southeast Asia. But now under Biden, he's paying attention to Southeast Asia, but not in a way that I think Indonesians, want to see it, because I think the US now is looking at Southeast Asia, still within the framework of its competition with China, and also within this interest of maintaining, US supremacy, as the global powers. Secondly, so I think we still waiting for a clearer signs that the US under Biden is different from Trump in the sense that, it's more interested to engage the regions in economic terms. So we don't see that yet. And in fact, it reinforced the earlier perception that US only interested in engaging the regions, through the military, instruments. The AUKUS, becomes, I think, the latest development that seemed to confirm the many, I think, Indonesians' perception about the nature of US engagement in the region. So that's, I think, the two questions that you posed. I will leave AUKUS question, for others, but very briefly, I would say that AUKUS is natural progressions of US-China rivalry. It's simple as that. Ralph understand me very well. I do believe in the balance of power. If you think your institution cannot help you, in this case Australia, then I'll go for balancing. I go for military alliance. Simple. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, I mean, just a reminder, of course, everyone can react on any question they want. We have the luxury of time, actually, and the discussion is interesting. But we can come back to AUKUS and the great powers afterwards, perhaps. Who wants to be next? Well, shall we? Okay, I'm looking at you.
To add to what Rizal said about the East Asia Summit, I think first, of course, he talked about need for reform and all that. But at this moment, I think there are already, as I said, some changes in the views among some of the ASEAN countries regards to EU's involvement in East Asia Summit. And if I'm not wrong, I do get a sense, for instance, the Vietnamese are quite keen to support. And in fact, Vietnam has this framework agreement with the EU where they are also participating in CSDP, or at least, the security aspect. So I think there are some supporters within ASEAN countries that are talking about trying to take a peek for the EU to become a member or to have a seat at the East Asia Summit. So I just add to that. And on whether Trump's and Biden's policies are any different, I think, like what Rizal said, the problem is the EU engaged Southeast Asia through the lens of its competition with China, rather than on its own merit. I think this point was also made recently by our Foreign Minister, Vivian Balakrishnan, who told the Americans that they should look at ASEAN also as a dynamic region for investment and all that, and should take ASEAN on its own merits rather than to be engaging ASEAN only through that lens of because of its competition with China. And I think that is something that we have to bear in mind. And just one last point that I want to reiterate, that I think we should really get rid of the assumption that the US will be a reliable ally in any case. I think unfortunately the US politics, US policy towards, I think, the outside was driven also a lot by domestic politics. And I think the domestic politics is so polarized and so unpredictable that I think anyone who thinks that the US will continue to be their reliable ally will be perhaps in for some shocks or some like the AUKUS or whatever.
Thank you. Like you mentioned Vietnam. I mean, I'm coming back to this question on who would be willing to support or who would carry this, EU integration. You mentioned Vietnam, but of course Singapore now has stepped up its bilateral relations with the EU. Indonesia is among the closest partners. So, would your kind of best guess would be either Singapore, Vietnam, or Indonesia, or?
I think these three countries that have started to be much more engaged in the security dimension that Bruno has mentioned in his presentation would be the three so-called natural partners or allies of the EU in the region to get the EU much more integrated into the various multilateral architectures.
Okay, thank you very much. And well, this somehow kind of naturally brings me to the Cambodian presidency for some reason. Ralph, would you want to take up on that?
Well, I think it's important to remember what happened 10 years ago when Cambodia chaired ASEAN. And I suspect Phnom Penh does not want to go through that experience all over again. And from what I understand, I've of course not been able to set foot in Cambodia now for a few years, but I also understand that they don't want to be overly dependent on China. And I think that is true of most continental Southeast Asian countries. So therefore, there might actually be some positive surprises. I do believe that they will be looking for alternatives. But we should not overemphasize the role of the chair in ASEAN is important, but ultimately it is a consensus-based decision-making process. And so the further upgrading of the ASEAN-EU partnership will involve many different parties. And I suspect that we will have different groups of countries pushing certain agendas. I can imagine Singapore being very keen on trade. I could see countries like Indonesia being very focused on the non-traditional security agenda, for instance. So I think the EU, as Lei Wei was saying, has a much better understanding of ASEAN than 10, 15 years ago. It has a much better understanding of how to build coalitions among the 10. And for those reasons, I do remain quite optimistic. I will also remain optimistic. All of us lost sleep over AUKUS or whatever you're supposed to pronounce it, because it came so suddenly. But I think we should also look at things in perspective. Ultimately, we had a situation where President Biden forgot the name of the Australian Prime Minister, where there was very limited content in what was said beyond the submarine contract. So when you were asking, is the middle way, is it the end of the middle way? I think that's too soon. I think we will have to see how that evolves. Also, I do believe that most countries will not put all their eggs in one basket. I do foresee Australia remaining very committed to its relationship with ASEAN. I do foresee a country like India, which is part of the Quad, to not fully commit to militarization of competition with China. So I think all of those countries, even the middle and the great powers, will hedge their bets as well. And for that reason, I think the middle way still has some future.
Can I add just to the Cambodian chairmanship? Because I think, like what Rob, I think you could be in for some pleasant surprise, because I look at the topics that they have chosen for both the Asia-Europe meeting that is coming in November and for their chairmanship of ASEAN next year. They are focusing a lot on multilateralism. And I think that's a theme that I think, again, the EU might want to really engage Cambodia at this point of view, because of the common, so-called the common narrative about, creating a inclusive multilateral order. So I think that should be, the EU should really step up its, again, diplomatic efforts in engaging Cambodia on this in the next few months.
Absolutely. Looking forward to that. And let us move to the AUKUS question. And sorry to kind of dig deeper, but somehow you are right. What Ralph said, and we heard that in the first session as well. I thought it was Kikuchi-san who mentioned that perhaps. Well, in the context of Quad, US is not the only power in Quad, and that Japan and India, more concretely, could perhaps help to shift the focus of Quad and somehow moderate the US competition or some of the US efforts to be too assertive towards China from within, right? And I believe that could be somehow a role for Europeans to play in their own bilateral dialogue with the US and engaging with others. So I believe that there is a natural sort of moderation that may take place. But let me turn to Dr. Shoji. From Tokyo, yes, we heard some initial reactions to AUKUS, but do you think that this would somehow change under the new administration that is coming to power? Will that have a major impact on the FOIP? Is there perhaps some revisions of the concept or adjustments of the concept that are in plan?
Yes, thank you, Eva, for your great questions, and thank you, other panelists, for great discussions, very insightful. And actually, from Tokyo, my sense is that the reaction or perception or recognition of the Japanese government is mixed. First, there is some feeling that Japan was excluded from a new framework. So the sort of the Anglo community itself consolidated, and Japan for Japan it's hard to enter this sort of the world. And the second point is that some of the government might be relieved. Actually, some years ago, Japan participated in a bid of Australia's procurement of submarines, and Japan lost the competition of bid. They actually now some of the people within the Japanese government might think that it was better for Japan to be lost in a bid. So because the contract cannot be sort of abolished. And with regard to the Japan's vision on FOIP, I think the Japanese government thinks that the new framework AUKUS will reinforce sort of the overall vision of the Japan vision on FOIP, in security in particular. Actually, the Japan might think that the sort of the cooperative frameworks should be multi-layered, not just some of the frameworks are existing independently. Like the economic cooperation, some of the frameworks like the CPTPP and RCEP and other types of frameworks of economic cooperation are multi-layered to reinforce each other. So currently, the Japanese government might think that the same kind of synergy and sort of the multi-layered sort of the mutually reinforcing effect, in terms of the thinking about the hawks. That's my point.
Thank you very much. Now that is surprising because we have no more questions from the audience and we still have over 10 minutes left. That's a luxury. But of course we do not need to stick to, wait. There's certainly, well, I blame the fact that there's just too many questions and people are shy and don't want to choose. It seems that there is then space for optimism, at least from what I can hear from the panel. I did receive a last question actually from one of the panelists who cannot post questions, which was on the implications of the COVID crisis. Whether that has succeeded as a test of solidarity, whether that is something that perhaps for ASEAN is likely to demonstrate a better cohesion among or better ASEAN solidarity. But talking of this, I mean, if any of you has some final words, reactions to each other, or perhaps want to fill in or complement some of the things that you've already said, what would be the kind of main takeaways? How could EU and Japan, should they just continue engaging with ASEAN? Should we not give up on our middle way? You have an opportunity for a last 1 or 2 minutes final concluding remarks. And in that case, I will just stick with the order of appearance. Ambassador Sukma, Rolf, Dr. Shoji, and Lai Hui, if that's okay for you.
Sure, thank you. I do have a number of issues that I think where ASEAN and EU, can work together, especially in addressing this, growing rivalry between US and China. Number one, we need to find a way to tell China and convince China that the world is not ganging up against, China. So that's, I think, number one message that we need to really deliver, to Beijing. Number two, we should also tell China that, the world is not yet 100% trusting China. There's still a lot of suspicion out there. So, I think because of the size, because of the rapid rise, because of the military power that China has, it's quite natural that a lot of countries are afraid of China, scared of China. So in that context, I think China should also, calculate, its policies, so it will not, scare other countries, to gang up against, China. So the case in point is, of course, the South China Sea and so on. There are a lot of countries get very afraid, when you see all these, vessels, going around, in your, economic, special economic zone, and so on. Number three, I think EU and ASEAN should also find a way on how to tell others, especially the US, that there is no need, for them to mobilize, a number of countries and then, try to corner, China, because that will not be very productive. But of course, the core of the question is really how to address those, each other concern, that will address those particular, I think, key issues, in this relationship between the US and China. So again, if you look at the region, so we don't have any forum, anything in the regions where, countries can actually raise this particular, concern with each other.
Thank you.
Yes, Eva, I will make 3 concluding points. The first one, I think it's important to remember that there are multiple narratives going on at the moment. And I think over the last 2 to 3 weeks since that big announcement coming from Washington, it looks like there is only one narrative existing, which is one of great power competition. But I think we need to calm down a bit and realize that even China and the US, while they'll be competing, they will also be collaborating. And I think there will be space for collaboration while balancing happens. And like Rizal, I'm actually a strong believer in the balance of power, but it can happen in a context where you also see collaboration taking place. So I think that's point number one. Point number two, a point that worries me, is the socialization of China. I think in recent years has not worked very well. I'm very alarmed by what you're seeing in the cross-strait relations right now with Taiwan. You still see a lot of assertive actions in the East and the South China Sea. So there is something which at the moment is not working with China, which was working in the early 2000s, which was this socialization through institutions. And I think that's something that we all need to pause and think carefully about. And as Rizal was saying, perhaps speak very candidly to our Chinese friends and say, listen, we want to collaborate with you, but at the same time, we are at times feeling threatened by your actions. Finally, on the EU itself, I think there are real opportunities for the EU to play in the region, but it should play such role as a normative power. I think when the EU tries to speak the language of great power competition, it doesn't work because then you have the standard line of where are your aircraft carriers. So the EU should do what it does best, which is to be a normative power, focusing on collaboration, on non-traditional security, on preventive diplomacy, and on trade. And I think if it sticks to that message, it has a great role to play in Indo-Pacific security. I'll end there.
Thank you very much. I think that there has been some studies actually by Kicker on the deteriorating image of China that have been forwarded up, but I'm not sure what the reaction has been, but there has been this awareness of a deteriorating image. Dr. Shoji, your final word.
Thank you so much. I'd like to mention two things. Firstly, with regard to the EU membership in EAS, I think this is a great idea, not only in terms of the EU-ASEAN cooperation, but also like the cooperation of Japan and EU in terms of the cooperating with ASEAN. However, I actually made some research about the sort of the establishing process of the EAS 10 years ago. Then the Japan tried to engage as many external powers as possible, like the India, Australia, New Zealand. But however, China opposed it. So the in terms of the EU membership this time, probably Japan obviously welcomes EU participation. However, some other members, like probably China, we oppose to it. So we have a lot of dispute about it. And the second point is that the hearing or European insightful, interesting discussions about the China. My sense is that the sort of the perspective seen from Tokyo is very different from the Southeast Asia or Europe. Our general view about China currently is China is more and more aggressive and more, internally, sort of the inward looking domestically. And China is more and more aggressive toward Taiwan. So it's hard for us to be very optimistic about the future of China and socializing or encouraging China to, sort of the, in a way, to participate in multilateralism in a way that we expect China to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lai Hui?
Well, I will just end by saying that first, I think following what Professor Shoji has said, we should really look into also cooperation that you mentioned, the three parties, ASEAN, Japan, and EU. And in this context, as the Japan and EU has signed this connectivity partnership, and I think that should be something that's leveraged for to be seen how can be operationalized in this kind. And as we know, connectivity agenda is very important for both the EU, Japan, and also for ASEAN in particular, right? So I think that's one point. The other one that I thought that we could give much more thought is also about EU-ASEAN cooperation on rethinking tourism. I think, you know, many of the ASEAN countries depend on tourism as a major part of the GDP, right, of their growth. And we know with the pandemic, not just the pandemic, but all this thing about climate change, people are more reluctant to I would say more reluctant to fly, but all these things about climate change. And I think tourism really needs a rethink. And I think that there's a lot of scope for both EU and ASEAN to come together to really start thinking how to make tourism more green, more sustainable. And I think that would benefit, I think also in EU countries, you know, a lot of countries, Spain and France, they also depends a lot on tourism. So I think that's one other thing that I think should be thought about in more detail. And then last word that I can't help not joining in about this Chinese aggressiveness. I think the Chinese should really rethink and transform their dragon diplomacy to panda diplomacy and make themselves more lovable as Xi Jinping said the diplomats should practice. So I think they should reorientate their mind, right? And not portray themselves so much as a dragon with lots of fire, but really maybe as a panda, much more lovable, yeah. So I end on that note.
Thank you so much, Lagui, for your optimism as well, believing that tourism is going to, you know, get back into normal and we can all travel, but also for the very constructive suggestions and recommendations. We will try to publish a report with some of the key takeaways and recommendations for also the European External Action Service, for the Japanese government, and perhaps to some of the ambassadors in ASEAN, of course, always hoping to throw that bottle of ideas and hoping that someone will pick it up somehow, and this is how ideas will travel. On panda diplomacy, anyone who has children is not you know, safe from many of the Chinese cartoons with pandas all over, but somehow, you know, perhaps that's something to be thought of better. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, for all of you. As you can see, Europe continues watching the Indo-Pacific and continues commenting on it. We hope, and it's very reassuring to see that there are colleagues out there who think very much alike, and I look forward to having you hopefully in person in Brussels at some point soon. Let's work towards that. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon and stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.